It's like POIs, right? Ooh, ooh, that's fancy. Being announced. Interesting.
Perfect. Perfect.
Yeah, good to go. All right, cool. So anyone else who's always been like, hey, this is really vague for me about judging or these kind of things, something that they want to learn, just feel free to speak up. Like, no need to raise your hand. Yeah, I see a hand. Yeah, I do not hear that, by the way, so it should be repeated by someone close to the laptop.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. I want to learn mostly about clashes. Like, how do you see what the clashes of the debate are, or stuff like that? Because I think that's useful for people that do debating as well.
Okay, sounds good. So seeing what the clashes are, right? So what are the main things in the debate by which you should resolve who gets the first and the second, etc. Okay. Anyone else? Yeah, I see a question in the back.
Miguel, so how do you keep track of everything that other people are saying? That's my main problem.
Yeah, can someone repeat the question?
How do you keep track of everything?
Yeah, I don't hear that. Sorry.
How do you keep track of everything that goes on with the debate?
Yeah, I still don't hear it. Very sorry.
Okay, this is online.
No.
Hello, Mike. Can you hear us?
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Yeah, the question was, how do you keep track of everything that is going on in the debate?
Okay. Yeah, how to keep track? Definitely, I have a few slides on that under the tips and tricks. So that's good. Because debaters speak fast. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay, cool. Then let's start. So why should you judge? And my main reason is it's fun, right? So I think judging allows you to watch debating, which is of course the sport that all of us really love, and see it from another light, right? You don't need to feel like you are being judged, for example, right? I know that for some people, it is scary to debate because there's someone going to judge them for their performance. But it's also just a lot of fun because you learn a lot of stuff and you get to know a lot of people. And just in general, I think it trains your debating ability. So that's the second one, to become a better debater. For those of you that don't know, this is the icon for the Myers-Briggs type indicator test, which is currently called debater. But I think judging pretty much indeed what the question was before, like seeing what the clashes are, by judging a lot, you get to identify, for example, these clashes more quickly, but you also get to kind of learn what do judges pay attention to decide who wins the debate, right? And if you've never really judged, you do get the resolution from the judge after the debate, but you've never really gotten the internal process of how they decide who wins and what the deliberation is like, these kind of things. So it will help you become a better debater. And just to make it a little bit more concrete, especially in the British Parliamentary whip speeches, right? Because you're pretty much judging a debate in a whip speech, just a little bias for your own side. So if you're a good judge, you're probably automatically a good whip. Not always. Of course, there's always caveats, but at least that's it. But I think also very importantly, and also given that Corona has hit a lot of societies pretty hard, to also give others feedback and help the society grow, right? So quite often as a judge, you are more independent and you notice things that people can improve much more quickly, but also things that are doing well, right? So I think a very important part of judging at Cicero as well is giving feedback to others and then helping the society grow. And then also helping others to maybe go to tournaments and maybe they can judge along, these kind of things, right? So I would also highly recommend everyone to, in case you don't already do that after debates, also just ask some feedback, even if it's just very simple, something that's a little bit out of scope for the workshop, but something that I would always do is ask very specific questions, like, what did you think of my rebuttal on this argument that my opponent brought, right? Because you wanted to work on that. But in means of judging, giving the others feedback helps. Just to check, by the way, do you guys see my mouse as well? Like the pointer? Yes. Okay, cool. So in case I need to point, that's all good. All right. So what is really the crucial stuff, right? So what do you need to remember when you're judging? Well, actually, who is the judge? So does someone have an idea? If they would have to describe, you are the judge, you're sitting there. Who are you? Are you yourself? Are you someone else? Feel free to speak up. Yeah, this is not working.
Oh, Mike, can you hear me now?
Kind of okay. Yeah. I think
You
that's
are-
pass, right?
Yeah, you are speaking as the average informed voter. Somebody who reads a newspaper, but who reads a shitty newspaper.
I wouldn't say if it's a shitty newspaper, indeed, but indeed, I think the average informed voter is kind of the main term that is being used. Sometimes in Dutch, in case some of you are Dutch, they would say algemene krantenlezer, so the average newspaper reader. But it's still a very vague term, right? What is average informed? What does that mean, right? I mean, people who only watch Fox News, they're informed, maybe wrong information, but they're informed. So here's some things to kind of take into account. First thing, you are neutral, right? So you do not have a tendency to say, hey, I think the proposition side of this motion is much more to my liking, so I adhere to it. But also, if you, let's say, feel, so I was once in a novice final debate I was judging, and the motion was this house would legalize dueling to the death. And one of my panelists thought that it was very difficult to defend the motion. So what she said is she thought that proposition won because they had a tougher time, right? Because it was more difficult for them to defend the motion. That's something you do not do, right? You assume that the motion is balanced, equally debatable. Even if you think it's not, you have to do it. And you're willing to be persuaded by either side. Besides that, you are intelligent, right? Doesn't mean that you might be university educated, maybe like you have some sort of degree, you kind of understand the general workings of the world, you're open-minded, etc. And there are some shared beliefs that you do have, right? So you're not a tabula rasa, right? You're not a clean sheet. It's not like you are just, don't have any opinions. There are some kind of moral beliefs that you can take into account, but those are generally more obvious, right? Like we like happiness, or we like freedom, or we like people being alive in general, right? And you're also moderately in favor of democracy, free speech, equal treatment, those kind of things. So in the end, if someone explains to you why an argument leads to more happiness, they don't need to explain why happiness is good, right? I'll get more into that a little bit later, what they should prove, but happiness in itself could be a good final impact of an argument. So this is very important. So I just want to make sure that this is clear to everyone. If it's not clear to someone, please just speak up, and I'll try to make sure that I hear you.
Unclear.
Yeah, I did not catch that. I'm sorry. Can you repeat that? We're good, I guess. We'll just go on. Okay. Cool. So now we're going into, so this workshop is generally based on British Parliamentary debate, right? For some of you that might know American Parliamentary, of course, you can extrapolate this in general to just the opening teams. But I think what's the most important thing is that you judge teams on their holistic persuasiveness, right? So just how you probably had a workshop on this, right? That if you're debating, you need to prove why an argument is true. You need to prove why it's important. You need to link it back to the motion and explain why it's the most important argument in the debate, right? So that's also how you judge debates, right? You assess whether teams have told you an argument that you believe to be true, whether it's important, and how it weighs up to the other two teams. And especially the final part is very important because sometimes, two teams, let's say opening government and opening opposition, they both have an argument that they prove to be true. They both prove why it's important, but you need to weigh them up, right? So you always judge comparatively, right? That's a fun word of jargon that you need to remember, comparative. to other teams, right? You always compare two teams against one another. So I'll get more into that a little bit later. Yeah, so that's kind of what you have to do. And then in general, you also judge with respect to the burdens, kind of, right? The burdens of proof that their side of the debate is attempting to prove, right? So let's say opening government is trying to prove that, let's see, banning smoking will actually lead to people smoking less, right? Very easy motion, very easy impact. Then they take on the burden of proving that smoking will decrease. So you assess them on how well they prove that smoking will decrease, right? So you also have to look a little bit as to what are they trying to prove on their side of the house, assuming that that burden is reasonable, right? I mean, if the motion is this would ban smoking and they talk about how they are going to stop people eating meat, right? That's of course a totally different debate. Okay, so that's opening teams. And then for closing teams, it's very similar actually, where the comparative weighing is a little bit more important because you judge closing teams also on the basis of their differentiation to their opening team, right? So you might have heard these terms like you were derivative, or the closing team was derivative of their opening side, or your material was highly similar. And that is because you were later in the debate, right? So you need to provide newer argumentation. So you can make a closing team lose to their opening because their arguments were derivative or too similar, right? One thing important to note, though, is that if you have new material on closing government or closing opposition for that matter, that doesn't mean that you automatically win, right? So the fact that coming up with a new argument is not enough for you to win over your opening team, because you need to do this comparative weighing, right? So it's the burden of a closing team to prove explicitly why they were better than the opening team. So they don't need to do that, of course. It makes them look better, but otherwise they leave it up to the judge to interpret whether their arguments were better or not. So always they need to differentiate themselves from their opening team. And one thing important to note, though, here is that rebuttal is also constructive material, right? So if I'm closing government and I only bring rebuttal, that could potentially be enough to take it over opening government if opening government, for example, never really rebutted the opening opposition team, and you really need strong rebuttal to defeat that opening opposition team. If closing government brings that rebuttal, they are likely to beat their opening government team. And of course, it always depends on context. We'll see that a little bit more later in the practice exercises. So that's kind of it. Here, and then I pause for questions. Sometimes it's very difficult to kind of know when is an argument believable, right? Also, when you're debating, it's like, okay, but when do I stop, right? When have I really proven that it's true, or really when it's important? And when you're judging, you can give that as feedback, but it's not necessarily important because you always judge two teams comparatively to one another, right? So if I stand up on opening government and I say something really dumb, and it's totally not believable, that doesn't mean that I have an automatic fourth, because opening opposition can say something even dumber. And the same thing, of course, goes on and on and on and on. Right? So always judge teams comparatively to one another. And more on that in later slides. Are there questions on this? Yeah? Was that a question or no? Okay, no. Let's go on. All right. So then, this is a bit odd indeed. So of course, after the debate, right, the debaters go outside. You have this panel discussion where you kind of discuss what do you think the results are and what do we think the final results need to be. So the first thing is that usually the chair judge gives you like 2 minutes to discuss or just to think about your call, and then you give your call. And one thing that I want to highlight is be honest. So what I said at the beginning, what I did when I started judging was kind of, if I'm unsure, just copy someone else or just entirely say nothing. But even if other judges have a different call, your call is not, so the call is like the result, right? Just to check. It's not wrong, right? Because that is how you, as a judge, read the debate. Whether you're wing or chair, you are equivalent in that panel discussion, besides the chair judge leading the discussion, having the tie-breaking vote. But if you just explain well why you think that this call is as such, like what you think it is, and just be honest, then that is just how you read the debate. And if, let's say, you think opening government came first and no one else thinks so, then apparently all of the other teams have not done enough to prove come first. Apparently opening government did the best job, right? So definitely be honest, because if you just copy someone else and they say, well, Mike, can you explain why you had opening opposition over opening government? But I don't actually believe that. How can I explain that, right? I have no way of looking into my notes where I wrote down, this is why they beat them, right? So always be honest, even if you're just starting out judging, but also particularly, you need to be able to explain your call. And that also means that, right, I did not put that one in, is that you can just say, I don't know. Or maybe you can say, okay, I know that I think that opening government took a first, but besides that, I have no idea. Or I'm doubting, but I think that this is the way, right? And that just means that the chair judge, who needs to lead the discussion, has more information to kind of ask you, hey, Mike, you were doubting here. What made you doubt, right? And maybe then, well, you explain, well, this is the reason, because they try to explain the truth in this way, but I did not believe them because some reason. Then maybe other judges might realize, right, that is indeed the case. And now I think that opening government plays lower, right? So just because other people are more experienced doesn't mean that they necessarily know better, because everyone can miss something. Yeah? Okay, cool. I see Bas leaning forward, so I thought he might have a question. All right. So, but also specifically listen, right? So also this is some pitfall that I fell in when I started judging, is being very pig-headed, right? Being very stubborn towards my call is the right one, but also be willing to listen to others, because you might have missed that they didn't give a certain example or that they made a certain link. So also be willing to be persuaded by others. But of course, if someone explains something to you and you don't agree, don't feel obliged to change your call, right? You were a judge. They should have persuaded you. If they didn't, they didn't, right? But be open to the fact that you might have missed something, whether you were dreaming, which happens quite a lot, right? You can kind of doze off in some way, or you just were just busy writing stuff down, or maybe they talked way too quickly, right? It's also fair to say you talked way too quickly. I could not understand you. This is my result. So I think that's one thing. One thing that's also going to come up in the practice questions, which I also found very daunting, is that judges may use very specific jargon, right? Like these very debatory terms like comparative and delta and these kind of things, right? If like a judge, for example, uses a lot of this jargon, right, that they say on the comparative, OG proved a bigger delta than CO or whatever, and you don't understand it, just feel free to ask them, right? You are there to learn as well. And if you don't understand them, you cannot be effective in your judging, right? So if you don't know what a delta is, just ask them, what's delta? By the way, delta means change. So that's good to know. One thing very, based on the rules is that indeed splits are possible, so a non-unanimous result. So in the end, you're going to maybe vote or you're not going to agree. And it's okay to not align with the rest of the judges, right? So I'm going to turn off my blur because I need to do that. Yeah, cool. All right. Oh, wait, no, I can draw. Nice, cool. Draw. Okay. People can see this, right? Yes, cool. So let's say that this is my call, right? Just chronologically, that's a very ugly 3. And in the end, we agree as a judge on this, and we're with 3 of us. So let's say I'm judging with Thomas and Bas, and both of them agree that opening opposition came in second. But I think, no, other way around, they think this. I hope that's not too small. So 2 here and 3 here. So these 2 swapped. It's okay for me to say, I do not agree with this, right? It doesn't have any impact because it means that the majority wins and that this will be the result. But then we call this, because you were not unanimous, we call this a 2-1 split. So 2 in favor and 1 against. So I was against and Bas and Thomas, for example, were in favor. Is this clear? So this is a piece of jargon that's you'll hear.
Yeah, by the way, Mike, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I guess I can sit closer to the mic so I can act as
No, I could hear you clearly.
Yeah, but so I can act as a sort of intermediary in case.
Yeah, now I hear you worse.
Yeah, I think if you're closer, it's worse. And I don't
Yeah,
know
to be
why.
directly in front. Yeah, okay, so I guess I'll stay here, right? You can hear me.
Yeah, all good.
Yeah.
So was that just to check the sound or?
Yeah, just to check, but everything.
Oh, okay. But checking, is this clear what like a split is? And also feel free to do so, right? Even if you're new to judging, even if you're new to debating, the debaters had to convince you. Apparently they did not do so. They're bad, right? And maybe, let's say, I'm the very daunting judge, right? And Thomas and Bas are judging with me. You can see in my face, I'm very dominant and very aggressive and very scary. It could still be that both Bas and Thomas think this call is correct, but I do not, and I'm the chair judge. Then they decide the result, even though I'm the chair judge, right? Because majority wins, and they might be less experienced, but apparently the debaters convinced them of this result, and that's fine, right? That's a fine result. Feel free just to stick to your beliefs. All right, cool. Last thing on this slide is that draws are not possible. So what is not possible is to be like, well, it was really close. Let's just both give them the second, right? That's not possible. You need to decide in some way. And quite often it's going to be on very mediocre things, right? Like this team did not provide enough rebuttal to this team. And it was kind of their burden because they were later in the debate, we say, right? They had more opportunity to attack them. Therefore, we're going to let these guys become second and these guys become third, right? And sometimes it's these very mediocre things, and those are the kind of things that you'll just learn at tournaments, right? I can't teach you all of the ways that you kind of disambiguate this stuff. So, hey, go to tournaments and judge. All right. Is this clear? Cool. Also, I lied. There's another thing here. There are no automatic fourth or firsts, right? So also when I started debating, you would sometimes see these really good debaters, right? They've won the European Championships and these kind of things, or they're from Oxford or whatever. It doesn't mean that they're automatically first, for example. Or sometimes that you might also hear, I don't know if you guys are the debating, shit posting kind of things, that you have this thing called EPL bias. So English as a primary language or proficient language or something like that. So people from England who have English as their first language, they generally do sound more persuasive because they're more fluent, let's say, in the way that they bring their arguments. But that also the fact that you speak good English, I'm not even sure if that's good English, doesn't mean that you come in first, right? So someone who's from Oxford doesn't always take a first, right? Otherwise it would be a very boring sport to play. But in the same sense, there are no automatic fourths, right? The fact that someone is a beginning debater, for example, or that someone makes a very weird argument doesn't mean that they're automatically fourth, because afterwards, someone can always stand up and say something even worse or something even less relevant to the debate, right? So make sure to stay open to that possibility and that there's no such things, right? Also, one thing that when I started was also a thing, of course, opening government has the burden of defining the debate, right? sometimes they screw up that definition. Still not an automatic fourth, right? Because other teams can botch it up even more, right? So just make sure to stay open to the possibility of other people doing worse or better, no matter who you are, right? I know it's difficult, unconscious biases, but try to, try to keep an eye on that. Okay. Is this all clear? So these kind of this panel discussion.
Yes.
Yeah. Cool. All right, so let's go to the tips and tricks. And here we'll talk about, for example, indeed, how to keep track, and then also kind of seeing what the clashes are. So the first thing is, and this is the best tip that I can give you, which really helped me, is keep making your call after every speech. So that means that if the leader of opposition, right, so the first speaker on the opening opposition has spoken, what if the debate ended right there? Right? Would the opening opposition win, or would the opening government win? Right? So let's say that we do have, after the, of course, after the prime minister, opening government only has spoken, so they would take the win, right? Then maybe after this, after the second speaker, so the first speaker on opposition, maybe they didn't do as great, opening government still wins, right? And especially after the fourth speaker, you'll see why this is important. So, well, let's assume the deputy prime minister doesn't do anything weird, right? They don't botch up their speech. Probably it will still be this, right? It would be really weird if it would suddenly swap around. But let's say that this deputy leader of opposition, she's brilliant. She speaks the stars out of the sky, or whatever the saying is. She steals all of our hearts and she flips the call, right? What's the issue here after the next speech? So let's say that the opening government in the end lost because they didn't prove the truth of their argument that well, right? What if the member of government, so the first speaker of the closing government, comes up and fills that hole, right? They explain really well why the argument from the opening government is true, right? And now suddenly, because of that speech, you believe that the arguments from the opening government beat the opening opposition. Does opening government beat opening opposition now? Someone just shout yes or no. I hear a no.
No.
Why not? Why not?
Because it's the closing government who beat their arguments, not the opening.
Exactly, right? So even though the material contributes to the opening government didn't do anything to put that material there, right? They set it up, but they didn't tell closing governments like, hey, you have to do this or bring these arguments and use these words, right? It was all the closing government. So that means that in any case, just make it a bit bigger, that always the opening opposition should still beat the opening government, right? Because they beat it here. Opening government didn't do anything here. They just sat there for 7 minutes or 5, right? So there's no way that the opening government, after the member of government speech, beats the opening opposition. Doesn't matter. But maybe we think, well, this truth was important. Proving that, but it's still not enough to beat the opening opposition, right? So then you would say, okay, maybe this truth was so much important that it really makes this argument better, and it was crucial to understand the argument from the opening government. This is going to be a result. And this kind of goes on through the entire debate because of this reason, because you want to make sure that you do not get biased later in the debate by other speakers, right? So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is that when the debate is over, you don't need the 2 minutes right after to still determine who won. Because, for example, you already determined that this is going to be the result. And now you only need to look in your notes to determine, okay, why did I again think that this was the result, right? Or am I still doubting on this one? Okay, let's just think a little bit back. Let's look at my notes. Why did I think that this was very close, and why am I doubting, right? And I don't need to think about 1, 2, 3, 4. I already have that, right? And that makes yourself much more efficient, and also keeps you a little bit more calm, right, during the judge deliberation, because you'll be a little bit less stressed. Also, again, it's completely fine to, for example, show up with this call and just tell to the judge, okay, I think opening opposition 1, opening government takes the 4th, and I'm still doubting between the other 2, right? So that's also completely fine. Yeah. So that's like, if you take away one tip from this workshop, this should be it.
Mike,
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. If one of the judges doesn't fill in the closing half, then there isn't a,
Yes.
how does a tie get broken if the other 2 judges don't agree on the call, the closing half?
Yeah. So in the end, you do need to vote, right? But this is just at the beginning when the chair just says, okay, the debate is over. Hey, Bas, what do you think? And Bas says, okay, I think this is my result. I am not sure. We're going to do our plus minus 10 minutes talk. And let's say that we have Mike who says closing government. And then we have Thomas who says closing opposition. Unfortunately, Bas, even though you're not sure, maybe during this discussion, you did become convinced by Thomas that indeed, okay, closing opposition won, right? And sometimes that is on very minor details, but you need to vote. Yeah, so it's just for in the beginning, so that let's say that I'm the chair judge, that and let's say that my result is very obviously also something like this, and for Thomas also something like this, then at least I know that we need to focus on the bottom half of the debate to see how are we going to resolve that actually, right? So it's mostly also for giving an idea of where everyone is. Yeah? Okay, best tip. Remember this, and when you also give tips to other judges, give this one. Okay, cool. So that's what I said. Closing government, sorry for the jargon and the abbreviations. Closing government cannot change opening government's ranking compared to opening opposition. So if opening government loses to opening opposition after the deputy leader of opposition, so second speaker of opposition, they will likely lose to opening opposition at the end of the debate. However, what if this is indeed my call, but I think it's very close, and then the closing opposition comes up, and opening government asks a killer POI, like it completely destroys the closing opposition's case. It can still be possible for that to switch the top half. And why? Because it was actively opening government's contribution to the debate, this POI. It's very unlikely unless it's really close, but it's possible, right? I've never really seen this happen much, but it is possible. Okay. Notes are crucial. So here we go with indeed how to keep track. So I do think that there's an own way of writing, right? So on the next slide, I will have a kind of an example of how I write it, like a recreation. I, for example, write my notes like in this format of the A4. I also know people who turn their page, right? I know people who write the entire debate on one A4. I use 4 A4s for writing down the speeches and 1 A4 for the summary, but I'll get into that a little bit later. So if something feels uncomfortable for you, for example, maybe you're going to try the way that I write my notes and it doesn't feel right, just feel free to vary, right? If only in the end, you feel like you can make the best result for the debate, like you can determine the best one. But also use abbreviations or symbols. So I'm an econometrician. I don't know if anyone of you is, but that means that I know mathematical symbols. So I also use those in my debating notes. And I want to give you 3 of them that do help. And especially the first one is very helpful. So let's go put that here. The first one is kind of an inverted E, and it's there exists. And that one I use quite a lot, because if they say there are people in society who believe that something, why would I write down there are people? I could write down this inverted E people, and I would write people not as people, but I would write people as PPL. And then in society, I would write in SOC, SOC, etc. Like these kind of things, right? Because sometimes debaters do talk very quickly. I think that's also why the question might have come that sometimes debaters speak much too quickly for you to be able to keep track. And then you need to use abbreviations. You need to use your own way of writing. Maybe you like to put arrows to specific places to determine like what did they respond to. Maybe something you do is, I'll annotate it on the next slide, is that you use numbers to indicate what they respond to, these kind of things. So just try some stuff out and see what kind of is most comfortable for you. I think if you'll go to a tournament and in all of your rooms, you'll compare all of the judge notes of all of your fellow judges, probably none of them are going to be the same in means of style, right? So just kind of get used to it. The other one is for every, right? If they say all people in the Netherlands, you could write down all, you could also write down this little inverted A kind of thing, but also just the is not sign, right? And the same thing applies to the equal sign. Just try to use a few symbols or abbreviations, these kind of things. One thing that I also do, which I think should be on the next slide, and otherwise I'll draw it, is how to indicate, for example, rebuttal, how to indicate their own arguments, these kind of things in your own notes. Yeah? Cool. All right. So just try to get used to that. If it doesn't feel comfortable, switch to something else. That's completely fine. People are not going to judge you on the basis of your notes. Okay, here are my notes, how I would put them. And I do see that it's not on there, so I'm going to get the annotate tool out again. Okay, so one thing that I put, oh shit. I hope my screen did not turn yellow for you guys. Now it's not, at least. So how I do it is, this is one A4. I'll send you the slides, by the way, afterwards. So don't worry about copying. I split it in half, right? So I have one A4, I split it in half. I do that by folding it and drawing a line. I put the abbreviation for the speaker here just to keep track. I like to put people's name in there because it makes it more personal. And then throughout the debate, I put my notes into this section. So I have another line here. This is the middle line, this one right here. And I put my notes here. And I'll get into this part later. In this column, I kind of put some quick notes. So maybe I just put a big T if I don't know why it's true, right? They say kids are bullied more because of A. If I don't believe that A is true, I just put a big T right next to it in this column, right? I don't need to write true or something. I know that for myself, T means I don't know if it's true. The same thing for important, same thing for C for comparative, or maybe you could say relevant, right? I don't know if it's relevant, or I don't know if it really hits on these big clashes in the debate. And sometimes I just put an X, like I don't believe it at all. I don't believe it's true. I don't believe it's important. I have no idea why they brought up Trump in a debate about the politics in the Netherlands or something like that, right? I also put smileys sometimes. Sometimes I put the smileys with the D if I think it's really good. I also put sad faces, these kind of things, right? So just get used to what you want, but also some other quick notes, right? So maybe you don't know why something is true, but then you say, maybe this was already answered in a POI to the opening opposition or something, right? You'll write down POI to OO, right? And then you would know, I need to look back to opening opposition, to the POIs, and then see if it was indeed already checked. And these are the kind of stuff that you can do in those 2 minutes, right? You already have the result because you applied this amazing trick that you learned on the last slide. So now you need to check, okay, I had to check this POI thing. I will go do that. I will check, no, it did not defeat it. So this is still okay. And then I can determine, does that impact my result that I put, right? I personally also use, besides using numbers, I nest my remarks if they go into a deeper layer of analysis. So you need to kind of get used to yourself by judging in debates and judging at tournaments about when to do this. But in general, the more indentation you see each line, usually the deeper the argumentation goes. And usually, right, it depends on how you write it, usually the better the argumentation, right? Doesn't need to be, because it depends on how you indent, but it can be a way of seeing this. I also use these equals arrows, let's say, to indicate impacts. So that means that if the other judge during the deliberation says, well, the impact of their kids are bullied more argument wasn't clear to me, I know that I need to look at this argument and I need to look for these arrows, right? So I don't even need to read anything. I just look for one and I need to look for this arrow, right? These kind of things. And the same thing, of course, applies to this one. One thing that I will talk about rebuttal, and then I'll stop to see if there are questions, is for rebuttal, I just put an R. I put a box around it because I like it. And then I just write CO2. Haha, carbon dioxide. But that just means that they are going to respond. Well, this person couldn't because it's a member of government, but let's assume that they respond to OO2, that they're going to respond to the argument that I labeled 2 from the opening opposition. And what that allows me to do is that if people talk very quickly, that I don't need to write down, oh, this was the kids bullied less argument from OO. It's just 3 symbols, right? So these are the kind of abbreviations that you can get used to. And then lastly, I put the call after the speech in the very bottom here. I don't want to make it too big, right? Here, of course, it's very big because it's an example, but sometimes people might walk past you like debaters and they could already see your call, or other judges might see your call. I don't like that because I don't want people to copy my call, and I don't want debaters to be spoiled by what I think of the debate, right? So probably I would just put a very small, like 1, 2, 3, 4, that you can kind of barely read it. Yeah, and then you see that after this speech, the call changed, and that's it. Okay, are there any questions on this? No?
Clear.
Yeah, awesome. Wait, how do I? Okay, cool. So again, why is do you guys screen turning yellow as well? No? Okay, good. It's freaking out. Okay, so then you've done the debating, right? And I'll talk about the clashes a little bit later, by the way, which was the question from before. Then you've done your judging, and you need to deliver your adjudication, right? Probably you're going to be the chair judge at some point, but you need to be able to explain your call. So how does that work? Well, how I would recommend it is to first give general feedback. So that could, for example, be none of the teams here really proved. One piece of feedback that often comes back as general feedback is remember to weigh up your own arguments against all of those other teams, right? You can prove your truth, you can prove your importance, but if you don't weigh up against the other teams, you put your judgment into the hands of the judges entirely. That's dangerous, right? So something like that, you could be like, hey, most of the teams or all of the teams, these kind of things, put that in there. If you don't have any, that's fine. Just go to the call. So, and then you give the call and you explain that comparatively. So what does that mean? Well, you can do several things. I've seen people go from first to second to third to fourth. I've seen people do it chronologically. I've seen people do it from 4 to 1. I personally like to do it chronologically. So from OG to OO, so kind of along with the debate. So what does that mean? That means that when you explain the result, only say, okay, so let's start with opening government. They told us X, Y, and Z. And they did that in this way. You want to give a little bit more context. You don't need to recreate the entire case. And then you say, okay, let's bring OO into the mix. You kind of tell them what they did. And then you say, okay, the reason why we made OO lose to opening government is this, this, and this. You leave these 2 teams out of it, right? Because you didn't take them into account because it's only about these 2 teams. Closing government might have made opening government's case better, but they did nothing to influence this top half. Then you would move to closing government, and you say, closing government did this, yada, yada, yada. They beat opening opposition because of these reasons, but they lose to opening government because of these reasons, right? You can integrate some feedback in there. So for example, maybe closing government lost to opening government. Hello, person who just came in. Maybe they lost to that because they didn't explain why their arguments were better, right? So you could say, well, next time you should explain explicitly at the end of your arguments why your arguments were better than your opening governments, and that is why you lost. So you give some feedback. However, leave out individual feedback. So I would not go, Thomas, come on, you were a member of government. This was your task. You should have done this, or you did this badly, right? You should not attack people or something like this, but also some people are not comfortable with receiving kind of this personal feedback in a larger group. And I think if you then let people come to you after the debate, they're more willing to listen. You can be a little bit more free, right? Because there are not other people that you need to take into account. It can just be you and the debater. So I would leave that out and just integrate some general kind of feedback. Yeah. What you should do is flag it. So kind of tell people when you talk about feedback versus when you talk about the call. So what do I mean by that? So if in a debate, teams do not give, for example, an argument that you would have expected to see in the debate, maybe on the government side, you can take that into account, right? You cannot say, well, I think that this argument is better, so you should have brought that. No. So then you say, well, this is just a piece of feedback. I would have expected an argument about how this impacts the most financially poor people in society because they're the most important group because of this. Then say beforehand, this is feedback. This is not why the government lost to the opposition, for example, right? Because it feels really stupid if judges make a call based on that, and they shouldn't. Yeah?
Yep.
Okay, cool. All right. So very little bit on tournaments, right? I'm not going to go much through this. So in general, it's not so different, but you have these individual speaker points. And there's going to be a link to a Drive folder. And it's going to have a speaker scale, which is for this. And it's going to pretty much indicate like what grade you get as an individual speaker. And there will be all kinds of descriptions. Don't worry about it. Like if you are at a tournament, just tell the chair judge you either don't have experience with it yet, and just take a look yourself. So that is fine. And also another thing is giving feedback to judges. And that is usually done by, let's say, a Google form or a form via the tab system that is used. Where also, I think it's also in this Drive folder, there are also judge feedback scales where you kind of also have, well, a judge can get I think they go from 1 to 5. They get a 4 if they adhere to these kind of set of qualities, let's say, right? They explain their call correctly, their call reflects the final result, these kind of things. Especially as a judge, definitely do that, because sometimes they take that into account to decide who gets to judge the final rounds. Right? If you might be an okay judge, but you do not give any feedback, then they might not break you. And the reason is because the chief adjudicators don't know every single judge present at the tournament, right? So, right, if let's say Thomas is judging at a tournament, right? I know who Thomas is. I know he debates at Cicero, but I don't know Thomas's qualities as a judge, right? So if I don't receive any feedback and I've never judged with Thomas during the tournament, how should I decide whether he should break or not? Right, so definitely give feedback if people ask for it. And one final thing before we're going to take a small break and then do some practice is, let's say you go to a tournament, right? And you very much impress the, let's say, chair judge, you get put down as a wing. And the next round you are put down as a chair of the debate. If you are not comfortable doing that, for example, because it's your first tournament, or you just, for any other reason, don't feel comfortable, just go to the chief adjudication team and be like, hey, you put me down as chair. Thanks for the opportunity, but I don't feel comfortable yet. This is my first tournament or first time judging or something like that. right? So also do that. And the reason is, of course, that if you're not comfortable enough yet, you will also, let's say, the oral adjudication will probably be of a lower quality than in any other case if you don't have much experience, right? So feel free to just be brave enough to admit it. You are there, like, remember the SpongeBob picture, you are there to have fun. If you don't feel comfortable being the chair judge, you will not have fun. So just feel free to admit it. Okay, then final thing, questions. And here I will kind of talk about the clashes, right? And then we'll stop for a little break until, like, I don't know, 5:30 or 25, something like that. I'll have Thomas decide. I think in general, seeing what the clashes are, it refers to what I talked about, how you judge these opening and closing teams, because they should take on the burdens themselves, right? So sometimes teams, did someone new come in again? Hello. Sometimes teams will already say, right, the team that wins the debate is the team that proves this. Maybe, maybe not. But in general, if there is a debate about this house would ban smoking, and the entire debate is, let's say, about health, but you feel that it should be about, like, health of the smokers, but you feel it should be about children, right? If it wasn't talked about in the debate, don't take it into account, right? So it's just about, in general, kind of what happens in the debate. And if teams were not structured enough to give you good structured clashes, you don't need to group them into clashes, right? That could be a point of feedback, right? You were not structured, you kind of were talking langs elkaar heen, you were talking like you were not engaging with each other enough, right? You were not clashing. So in that sense, there's less of a burden on a judge to identify clashes than it is on, for example, a whip speaker, right? They probably should, and a judge doesn't necessarily need to be. But in the end, you'll probably identify that opening government won the debate because they had these arguments about, let's see, maybe they did talk about children, right? How this impacts the health of children quite a lot. And you found that important, then that could just be a major point in the debate. It doesn't need to be a specific clash. Because if no one responds to it, but you still think it's the strongest argument, it's not a clash, but it's the major point in the debate. Right? So in that case, I would say don't worry too much about trying to see what the clashes are. Just kind of judge these teams holistically on this truth, importance, and how you compare them to one another. I don't know who asked the question. I hope that answers it. Yeah, cool. All right, then I want to propose taking a small break. My face looks really orange. Holy shit. Maybe let's say until 25 or 30, Thomas.
Mike, since we usually end the meeting around 9. So
then we'll continue.
Yeah, so if you don't mind, unless everyone wants to take a small break, or is it fine with continuing? Yeah. Okay, here
I think it'll take like maybe 20-25 minutes more.
Okay, that's fine. So I guess in that case we can continue.
Continue? Yeah, everyone good? Okay, let's make my face not orange. But let's make it a little bit more interactive, and I hope that I can hear all of you. Okay, so I do want to note that we're going to do some questions, as I said, from the EUDC, so European Universities Debating Championships, or the European Championships. And this is a test that is sent to judges before the tournament to kind of, what I said before, to indicate how good of a judge everyone is, because on a European level, there are way too many debaters. So how can a CA team know what all of these debaters are? So or how good they are at judging. So they send out these tests with questions to kind of answer. And the cool thing is also that there is someone from the chief adjudication team, so the CA team, who will talk about the answers and explain why these are correct. That is linked in the slides at the end as well. And this is a guy that won the European Championship, so he knows his shit. So I would recommend looking into that a little bit later. Maybe if only for the questions that we're going to talk about now, but maybe also the other questions, and then make them yourself before. And I do want to note that these can be pretty tough, so feel free to not do it. Okay. I kind of want to have a poll option, actually. I don't know if I can do that or if someone else needs to do that because I'm not a host.
Well, I think that's a bit of an issue because we're not logged.
Oh, right. The rest is not here. Haha.
Yeah.
Okay, then we're just going to raise hands. Okay, so right at the top here, I have some jargon or abbreviations if you don't know what all of this stuff means. So just the general teams. Top half is the opening teams, and POI, of course, is point of information. And the question might be a little bit long. We're just going through it a little bit slowly, and then we'll have a few options. Okay, so the motion is this house, as the young Jesus of Nazareth, would preach socialism. And the situation is this. So the top half, the opening teams, discuss what is best for the modern Christian church. Closing government stands up and claims Jesus of Nazareth was not Christian. Christianity and the church did not exist at the point in time where the motion occurs, right? Because it's as the young Jesus of Nazareth. And so the good of the church would not have been a consideration for him, for Jesus. Yeah, that's so clear, I hope. Closing government further argues that young Jesus wanted to reform Judaism and argues why, according to the text of the New Testament, socialism follows Jesus' vision for a better society. And then there's going to be the option in a few seconds. So is this clear to everyone? I hear no things. So A, CG is off clash. I'll explain that in a minute. The top half is likely to defeat CG. Right? So what that means is that they think that perhaps this could be results. Off clash pretty much means not relevant to the debate, right? So they're missing the entire point of the debate. It's not relevant. Yeah? Ah, shit. Wrong button. Okay, next option. Closing government introduced a new clash on the question of what Jesus wanted, but must defeat opposition's arguments on what's in the church's interests. C, closing government shifted the burdens in this debate, and given they have good enough analysis, closing government is likely to defeat the top half, right? So here they say, for example, this could be a result. Yeah. And lastly, unless closing government flagged this case in a POI to top half, it should not be credited. So they should have put in a POI, hey, we are going to talk about this, right? So just take a little bit of time while I take a sip of water. Okay, just by show of hands, who thinks that A is the correct answer? Is there anyone, by the way? Yeah. Okay. Cool. We'll get into that later. Yeah. So let's just first inventorize what people think. Who thinks B is the correct answer? No. Yeah. Okay. A few hands. Who thinks that C is the correct answer? Okay. So quite a few hands. And who thinks D is the correct answer? Okay, cool. Yeah, so in this case, majority wins, indeed. So the correct answer is C. So let's go back to the person who said A, right, on the far left. Why did you choose A?
Asking me to.
Yeah, but maybe there's a valid reason, right? We're now in this discussion, and you need to convince me that closing government is off clash.
I just feel like it's not really fair to say that, to refer to that Christianity didn't exist at that point, because socialism also didn't exist at that point. So it kind of beats the purpose of the debate to talk about the chronology order of all the things happening in time, because the motion itself defeats that debate on that At least that's how I read it.
Yeah, I do think that the notion that socialism didn't exist is a fair notion indeed. I do think that the motion kind of assumes that Jesus knows about socialism, right? Because otherwise this motion would never be defensible. So I do not think that that is necessarily a reason. So I do think that closing government, we'll get into that, is on clash. Well, otherwise A will be the correct answer. But we'll get into that a little bit later. So I did see hands for B. Who said B?
One said B.
Someone said B, right? Okay, no one said.
I don't know. I just feel like the CG argument. I mean, I don't really see the connection to the first one, I guess, fully, because church and then going into vision, I guess.
Yeah, no, I also think that is fair. I also think that B is probably it's kind of the throw-off answer. And the reason why B is incorrect is I want to take a stab, because I do think that in general you should defeat your opposition's arguments, of course. Usually I point at people to give answers, but I can't really do that because I'll just be pointing at the camera. So why is B incorrect, someone? Otherwise, I know 3 people's names here, so I'm going to just say someone's name. Yes, go ahead.
Let me just quickly finish what I was doing. All right. So, I think the reason why B is incorrect is the same reason why C is correct, which is it's an actor motion. So the idea of what would be good for the church is not really relevant because it's about this house as Jesus of Nazareth. So that's why I think C is correct, and I think that's also why in B you don't have to defeat opening half or top half because they weren't talking about something that was relevant for the motion.
Yeah, exactly. So because you shift the burdens in the debate, and we're going to assume that these burdens were correctly shifted, right? That indeed we believe closing government in this case for now. If we do believe them, then that is inherently already rebuttal to the opposition's arguments, right? So if we believe that indeed the church is irrelevant, then you've already defeated their arguments, right? So they must defeat the opposition's arguments, but they already did by doing this shifting of the burdens. Yeah. Did someone say D, by the way? I don't remember.
Yeah. The reason why I chose it, I thought, was because I have a hard time believing the first claim that it was made, namely to the fact that that Jesus could not preach socialism because the Christian church didn't exist at that time. And the reason why I think this claim is irrelevant is, I guess from the motion, we would just assume that it would be possible, right? So I don't see that claim as being relevant to the debate, essentially.
Yeah, okay. So why did they need to flag it in the POI?
Because I guess they could just bring it up as a potential problem with the argumentation of I don't know, opening government or opening opposition, but making it as the main claim of their argument just seems a bit irrelevant, given the fact that we would assume that preaching socialism was would be possible in this motion.
Yeah. So the main idea behind the answer is that people sometimes think that, well, opening government and opening opposition couldn't have seen closing government's case coming, so they had no opportunity to respond to it. So therefore, you need to flag it in a POI to the top half. And that's just not true, right? It's you don't need to flag your case in a POI to the top half, even if it's new. The closing government or closing opposition is later in the debate, so it's more difficult for them to make a case, right? Because arguments are more likely to be snatched up already. But that also means that there's a burden on the opening teams to already kind of predict what could come up in the debate and kind of insulate themselves already. And I do think that assuming, and that's why C is correct because of this little bit, given they have good enough analysis on why the Christian church did not exist and what Jesus actually believed. That is why, the shifting of the burdens is completely fair. It did not need to be flagged. Yeah, I think for a more extensive explanation, of course, watch the video because this is very quickly. Okay, we'll go to question 2. So this is very small question. So you're judging a debate. Opening government's case is defeated by OO. Closing government has no constructive extension, so they don't have their own arguments, but they provide a number of new responses that are sufficient to beat OO. Right? So let's draw that out. Yes. Okay. So what do we have? We say here, opening government's case is defeated by OO. Like this. Closing government has no constructive extension, but provides new responses that are sufficient to beat OO. So probably this is the case, right? So I just do the arrow with the greater sign, just to make sure that it fits. Yeah, so this is the case. Okay, which of the following is true? A, since closing government did not provide a constructive extension, they must take a fourth. Then we rank opening opposition above opening government because they had the stronger case, right? So this part. B, closing government must come behind opening government as they had no constructive extension. C, it is impossible to rank these teams. Opening opposition, let's get my draw. Opening opposition must beat opening government. Closing government must beat opening opposition, and opening and opening government must beat closing government, or D, none of the above. And so take it in for a sec. All right, who votes for A? Yeah, no one? Who votes for B? Anyone? Can someone just, Thomas, can you shake yes or no?
No one voted for B.
Okay, someone for C? No? So that must mean that everyone votes for D. Who votes for D?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Who wants to, someone who hasn't spoken yet, who wants to volunteer to explain? It's correct, by the way. Indeed, it is D. Otherwise, I'm going to point ish. Okay, so the person in the far back with the white shirt. Like the second from the left, hello, with the glasses.
There's 2 people with white shirts and glasses in the back.
The other left. Sorry, other left.
Also Alex, right? With glasses, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And this was just pure intuition, but I think that the first one is kind of insufficient because I wouldn't say that they did not provide a constructive extension that they filled their role, but because like it just seems irrational to me that there is that like it's that there will be closing government obligations on that. Maybe I'm mistaken, but
Yeah, exactly. So what we discussed. Yeah, sorry.
B then both also the same. C, I'm not sure.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't catch the last part.
C, I'm not sure, but I mean, it's possible to rank all of the teams. C.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so for A, we already discussed that rebuttal is constructive extension, right? So the fact that they in the sense that it is an extension, and that does mean that you can fulfill your role by giving rebuttal, right? So that's one thing, but also there are no automatic fourths, right? So that's just inherently already incorrect. The second part is true, right? Probably we do rank OO above OG. The second thing is pretty much the same reason, right? So these two are quite similar, except for this is not as hard as they have to take the fourth, just behind opening governments. Again, rebuttal can be enough. C, it is possible because closing government, if we do think that the rebuttal is so good, can defeat the opening government. Here's the thing though, it can appear that, for example, you do indeed think that, okay, the closing government beats opening up, and opening government beats the closing government. So you do get this circle. It doesn't happen often, but you need to choose some way to break this circle. And again, it's sometimes very minor things, right? Like, oh, they should have, they don't explain why the rebuttal weighs more heavy than their constructive material. So then you say, let's see, let's get red. Then you say this, fuck's sake. Then you say that this one is not going to be valid. So you need to break it in some way, and this is going to be the call, which is really weird, right? Because if you would have broken this one, then they would have taken the first. But it doesn't happen often, but it can happen. So you just need to choose. Quite often, you'll just have the chair judge who will maybe make the cut because you'll be have spent a lot of time. So none of these apply, so it has to be D. So mostly, if it says all of the above or none of the above, pretty good choice to go for that one. All right, so let's go to number 3. Again, you're judging the debate. Opening opposition and closing government have very similar quality of arguments. They are both relevant to the debate and have analysis of similar depth, right? So this is what I talked about before. They both proven the truth and importance, maybe unsure about who will win. Opening opposition has offered multiple points of information to closing government, but those were never accepted. Yeah, so this is maybe, we didn't really talk about that much, but this is where you learn. Which of the following is most true? A, refusing to take a POI is against the rules. Closing government will be placed fourth in this debate unless CO also shuts out OG. B, closing government's refusal to directly engage with OO harms them in the comparison. Therefore, OO is likely to be ranked above closing government. C, refusing to take a POI does not affect the quality of the material given, so the ranking should not be affected by this. Depending on how glaring the lack of engagement was, the judges can decide to subtract 3 individual speaker points from each speaker in closing government. And lastly, this does not change the ranking or speaker points at all, because closing government are allowed to take POIs from closing opposition exclusively. Yeah, so is the question clear to everyone?
Yeah.
Sounds good. Okay, who votes for A? I just trust Thomas to say yes or no again.
No.
Okay, who votes for B? Okay, quite a few hands. Not everyone, I think, right? C. Yeah, I see also some hands. Cool. And D? Anyone?
No.
No? Okay. So again, majority wins. B is indeed the correct answer. Let's just speed through this quickly because I think the next question is also very useful and my battery is almost dying. So first thing to notice about C is we do not subtract speaker points on the basis of, for example, not engaging, right? So the speaker points are decided entirely based on the speaker scale that you can find in the slides when I send them to Thomas, and Thomas will share them with you, or Greg, whatever. So that's a thing. A is incorrect because there's nothing in the rules about not taking POIs, right? In some tournaments you do have mandatory POIs, but they will announce you beforehand, and I think it's mostly in Asia. On D, you are allowed to take POIs from closing opposition exclusively, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't change the ranking or the speaker points, at least specifically the ranking, because it's close and closing government comes after opening opposition. You want to give them some sort of way to engage. So therefore, they actively refuse to directly engage with OO, and you need to rank them in some way. This is often a reason why you place a closing team behind an opening team if it's close. Yeah? Cool. Oh, I remember last time I gave this workshop, I also forgot to put this answer in. This is also wrong. It's a legitimate strategy by a team to refuse any POIs to gain more time to deliver their points. They should not be penalized. Same reason, right? You refuse to actively engage, so therefore you probably lose the comparison. All right, last question. There is a question 5, but I'm going to skip it. The motion is this House would financially incentivize individuals to leave isolated religious communities. Opening government says we need to pay these individuals to compensate for their isolation and the fact that they lack the knowledge and skills that the rest of society has. Opening opposition says we are fine with forcing these communities to send their children to secular state-owned schools to achieve the same goal. And then later, the leader of opposition claims that the state has no right to interfere in one's religion and one's religious choices. So which one is true? So the LO is the opening opposition's first speaker. A, LO effectively shows this policy is both unnecessary given the alternatives and is illegitimate. Thus, OO is likely to beat OG at this point. B, unless OG explicitly point out the tension in OO's case, it is irrelevant when comparing opening government and OO. So tension is another piece of jargon where which pretty much just means they're contradicting themselves. C, opening opposition's argument contradicts their proposed alternative, right? So sending the children to schools. Therefore, the argument should be completely ignored. Or D, LO's proposed alternative is in tension with their arguments, thus weakening it to some extent. So while you guys are thinking, I will plug in my laptop. All right, who votes for A? Anyone?
None.
No? Okay, who votes for B? Yes, I see Bas. Anyone on the other side? Yes, another person. Okay, you're not alone, Bas. Who votes for C?
None.
No? And then D? Yeah, I'm not sure everyone voted though. But let's go. Okay, so Bas, you voted for, was it B? Right?
Yes.
Yes. Why do you think that's true?
I think it's true because if something is not rebutted, it's assumed true. Thus, if an argument is stated and nobody rebuts it, it's presumed to be accurate and believable. And therefore, each contradiction needs to be pointed out for the judges to accept. As a
okay. If you watch a debate in the House of Representatives of the Netherlands, right? And then our good friend Thierry Baudet stands up and he contradicts himself. Does Jesse Klaver need to point that out for you as an average informed voter to believe that he's contradicting himself? Or can you make that decision yourself?
Well, if somebody doesn't point it out directly, it's kind of easy to miss it.
Yeah, okay, so assuming you have noticed the tension, of course.
Then it isn't.
Right, probably you would have still noticed the contradiction and it would still weaken it, so you can take it into account. Let's see, no one voted for A, I think. Someone who voted for C. Because A is also incorrect, by the way, so hey, go, everyone. Who voted for C?
I would have voted for C. I didn't vote, but I would have.
Okay, can you explain? Yeah, okay. Also, shame for not voting.
I'm still thinking about it, okay? No, for me, it's like they are so contradictory. You can't say one without the other. So if you introduce them both at the same time, you're basically saying nothing. They cancel out.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. And this is also something which is a little bit in the rules. If someone contradicts oneself, so this also happens, let's say that you and I are a team and I speak first, and then, no, let's do it the other way around. You speak first, and then I speak and I contradict you. We assume that the first thing that was said is correct, right? But that doesn't mean that we won't take it into account. So D is the correct answer. So you do kind of weaken your own argument, but you should not ignore it entirely, because you still made the effort of making the argument, right? The debater still stood up, proved its truth and its importance. But then they do weaken it a little bit later, but you probably still believe it to some extent, right? Indeed, maybe you contradict it. So it's like I think Bas said it, right? That it kind of, or maybe you actually said it. I'm actually unsure. It's late. That they kind of cancel out, but maybe the contribution that they did is larger than the amount of harm that they did to the case. So it probably weakens it, but doesn't defeat it entirely, right? So here the correct answer is D. As said, there is going to be a question 5 on the next one, but I'll skip it. So don't be scared. It's also going to be a very long one. So that's also why I want to skip it. So there's going to be this one, and then there's going to be the answers. Do you guys want the answer to this already, or do you guys? Nah, you can watch the video. It's a good one. So as I said, there's going to be the judging test. I've put that in the folder, which I will share with Greg, I think. So it can be pretty tough. There's a video in which they refer to, where they kind of show a part of the debate, and then they are like, hey, judge this or something like this. And then there's an answer with explanation. They do show the correct answer immediately. So they would be like, they would have this slide, and they would have, I don't know if A is the correct answer, but they would highlight this in yellow immediately. So what I would do is use the PDF that the judging test that I put in the folder, and make it yourself first, and then watch the video, right? Because otherwise you'll learn less. Okay, that's it. Are there any leftover questions?
Yeah, I have.
Yes, go ahead.
Regarding the question number 4,
Yeah.
say we do have arguments from the opposite, say one side, and they contradict each other, and say that's a main clash, and the deal is to decide whether that's true or false, and should the contradicting argument be used as the argument for the opposite side in deciding which is true?
So if I understand correctly, so I'm going to pose 2 alternatives how I understand your question. So do you mean, let's say that this is their argument, and then they contradict oneself? Do you mean, in this case, the government can use it against them, or the closing opposition? So what do you mean?
Could you maybe give an example? Maybe that would.
Yeah.
So say the judge has to decide, say that's a big deal, and judge has to decide is whether in this debate, this question or this clash, or the statement has to be true or false. Say the opposition argues it's false, proposition argues it's true, and the say second speaker of the opposition argues in favor of the government, and can that be taken into account as an argument of the government?
So not necessarily. So if I understand correctly, kind of the deputy leader of opposition, instead of arguing their own case, they argue for the wrong side of the motion, right? you would not count that as, for example, being points to the opening argument or the closing argument. It just means that they make no valuable contribution to their side of the debate. So let's say that opening opposition beats, let's say that we have this situation, right, where I think it's most relevant is that we have this one. For some reason, the first speaker beats both the government speakers. And then this speaker right here does the thing that you talked about. It does not mean that suddenly it will necessarily flip. It's kind of a case-by-case basis for which I would probably just say that their speech in this case would be irrelevant, right? So the fact that opening government did not make this contribution harms them a little bit less, because the case for the opening opposition, so this guy here, right, you have two people, this still stands, and they made that contribution. This person is contradicting. This is the sign, by the way, I use for contradiction, which if you study econometrics, you might know from proof by contradiction. So they contradict them, but we assume that the first thing that was said was true, right? So we don't, let's say, deduct speaker points or deduct ranking just because they contradict them. You kind of assume that what they said didn't really happen, and you can say it in individual feedback, but you don't say like, oh, you get -5 speaker points, for example. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Anyone else? Okay, cool.